Chapter 1. A Night to Resilience. The warm glow of the city lights reflected off the windows of a bustling nightclub, where laughter and music mixed with the faint smell of alcohol. Brandon had never been the type to frequent places like this, but tonight wasn't about choice. A friend had dragged him here, insisting he needed to live a little. Yet, Brandon found himself awkwardly nursing a drink in the corner, watching as others danced, flirted, and lost themselves in the night. He was about to leave when he spotted Joshua. Joshua Lee, tall, confident, with sharp features and an aura that seemed to command attention without effort. Brandon didn't know much about him, other than that he was from an elite family whose name carried weight in business circles. Joshua looked like he belonged here, his tailored suit somehow fitting in perfectly amidst the chaos. When their eyes met, it was like the world momentarily paused. Brandon looked away quickly, feeling self-conscious. He wasn't sure why someone like Joshua would notice him, but before he could process it, Joshua was standing in front of him, a drink in hand. "You look out of place," Joshua said, smirking. "I could say the same about you," Brandon replied, trying to hide his nervousness. Joshua laughed, a sound rich and surprisingly genuine. "Touché." What started as small talk turned into hours of conversation. Brandon wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or Joshua's magnetic presence, but he found himself letting his guard down. He talked about his struggles, his mother in the ICU, the mounting hospital bills, and his constant fight to keep things together. Joshua listened intently, his usual aloofness replaced by something softer, almost empathetic. They were two strangers from entirely different worlds, yet in that moment, it felt like they understood each other. One thing led to another, and before Brandon could think it through, they were in Joshua's penthouse. It was a night of passion, reckless and unplanned, leaving Brandon both exhilarated and confused. The next morning was a harsh wake-up call. Brandon woke to the smell of coffee and the sight of Joshua, already dressed and exuding his usual air of control. For a moment, Brandon thought there might be something more to this, a connection, perhaps. But Joshua's next words shattered the illusion. "This never happened," Joshua said bluntly, placing a neatly folded wad of cash on the nightstand. "Forget about it." Brandon's heart sank. He stared at the money, a mix of humiliation and anger bubbling inside him. "I don't need your money," Brandon snapped, shoving the cash back toward Joshua. Joshua raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Take it. Consider it. Compensation for your time." Brandon left without another word, the humiliation clinging to him like a second skin. He told himself it was a mistake, something he'd put behind him. But fate had other plans. 2 weeks later, Brandon received an unexpected phone call. It was from Joshua, though his tone was far from the confident man Brandon had met. "We need to talk," Joshua said, his voice tight with urgency. Brandon hesitated but eventually agreed, meeting Joshua at a high-end cafe. Joshua didn't waste time with pleasantries. "My family found out about that night," he began, his jaw clenched. "And now, they're insisting I marry you to fix the situation." Brandon stared at him, stunned. "What? Why would they care? And why me?" Joshua ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically frustrated. "It's complicated. My family's reputation is everything to them. They think marrying you will keep the tabloids quiet. As for why, let's just say you're convenient." The words stung, but Brandon couldn't dwell on them. He had bigger concerns. "I can't marry you. Joshua cut him off. "I'll pay you. Enough to cover your mother's hospital bills and more. Just agree to this. And once things settle, we'll end it. Clean break." Brandon's mind raced. This was insane. But the thought of his mother lying helpless in that hospital bed was enough to make him consider it. He hated that Joshua was using his vulnerability against him. But what choice did he have? "Fine," Brandon said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Joshua nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good. The wedding's in 2 weeks." And just like that, Brandon's life took a turn he never could have anticipated. As he left the cafe, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a deal with the devil. Yet, somewhere deep inside, a small part of him wondered if there was more to Joshua than the cold, calculating exterior he presented. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change both of their lives forever. Chapter 2. A Deal Sealed in Silence. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur for Brandon. His life, already chaotic, now felt like it was spiraling out of control. He still hadn't fully wrapped his head around the arrangement, and every time he tried, his thoughts were interrupted by questions he couldn't answer. How had he ended up here, marrying a man who had all but admitted he didn't care about him? The venue was a testament to the wealth and power of the Lee family. A sprawling estate with manicured gardens, crystal chandeliers, and an air of opulence that seemed almost suffocating. Brandon stood awkwardly in the groom's suite, adjusting his tie in the mirror. The suit was tailored to perfection, but it felt like it was choking him. A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was Mrs. Lee, Joshua's mother. She was an elegant woman, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Brandon's appearance. "You clean up well," she said, though her tone was devoid of warmth. "Thank you," Brandon replied, unsure of what else to say. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Let me be clear, Brandon. This arrangement is a necessity for my family's reputation. I don't care what you do outside this marriage, but in public, you will play your role perfectly. Understood?" Brandon nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She handed him an envelope, her fingers lingering for a moment. "This is the first installment of the money for your mother's hospital bills. The rest will come after the wedding." Brandon took the envelope, and his hands trembling slightly. He hated himself for needing it, for being in this situation. But when he thought of his mother, hooked up to machines in the ICU, he knew he didn't have a choice. The ceremony itself was a spectacle. Guests filled the grand hall, murmuring in excitement as they awaited the arrival of the grooms. Brandon stood at the altar, his heart pounding as the weight of the moment settled over him. When Joshua finally entered, all eyes turned to him. He walked with the confidence of a man who was used to being the center of attention, his expression unreadable. Brandon couldn't help but feel small in comparison, like an afterthought in the grand scheme of Joshua's life. As the vows were exchanged, Brandon struggled to keep his voice steady. Joshua, on the other hand, delivered his lines with practiced ease, as if he were closing a business deal rather than committing to a lifelong partnership. "You may kiss," the officiant announced. Brandon froze. He hadn't considered this part, but Joshua, ever the composed one, leaned in and placed a brief, impersonal kiss on his lips. It was over in an instant, but it left Brandon feeling more exposed than he'd ever been. The reception was a whirlwind of handshakes, forced smiles, and endless questions. Guests approached them, offering congratulations and thinly veiled curiosity about their love story. Joshua deflected with charm, spinning a tale of serendipitous romance that had Brandon marveling at his ability to lie so effortlessly. Later that night, they returned to Joshua's penthouse. The space was cold and modern, a stark contrast to the warmth Brandon associated with home. Joshua loosened his tie, his expression finally cracking to reveal exhaustion. "Well," Joshua said, pouring himself a drink, "that's done." Brandon stood near the window, looking out at the city lights. "You make it sound like a chore." Joshua turned to him, his gaze sharp. "Isn't it?" Brandon didn't reply. Instead, he changed the subject. "Your mother gave me the first payment for my mom's bills." Joshua's jaw tightened. "Good. That's the only reason you're here, isn't it?" The words cut deep, but Brandon refused to let it show. "And what about you? Why did you agree to this?" Joshua's eyes darkened. "Because I had no choice. My family's reputation comes first. Always." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Brandon realized then that Joshua was as trapped as he was, though for entirely different reasons. "I'll sleep on the couch," Brandon said finally, grabbing a pillow and blanket. Joshua didn't stop him. Instead, he downed the rest of his drink and disappeared into the bedroom without another word. That night, as Brandon lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled over him. This wasn't a marriage. It was a business arrangement, a means to an end. But for the sake of his mother, he had to endure it. Yet deep down, a small, stubborn part of him wondered if there was more to Joshua than the cold, calculating man he presented. Perhaps in time he'd find out. Or perhaps this was all there would ever be, a marriage built on silence and necessity. For now, all Brandon could do was survive. Chapter 3. The Cold Reality. The days following the wedding were as cold and transactional as the vows themselves. Brandon moved into Joshua's penthouse, a pristine yet impersonal space where every piece of furniture seemed chosen more for its aesthetic than its comfort. The place didn't feel lived in, and Brandon couldn't help but feel like he didn't belong. Joshua wasn't around much. He left early in the mornings for work and often returned late at night, carrying the weight of a high-powered corporate job. When he was home, he spent most of his time in his office or on calls, leaving Brandon alone in the cavernous apartment. Brandon tried to settle in, but it wasn't easy. The kitchen was stocked with expensive ingredients he didn't know how to cook. The walls were decorated with abstract art he couldn't understand, and the silence was deafening. The only comfort was the knowledge that his mother's hospital bills were being covered, though even that came with a sting of guilt. One evening, after a particularly quiet day, Joshua came home later than usual. Brandon was in the living room flipping through TV channels without really watching anything. Joshua walked in, his tie loosened and his expression unreadable. "Long day?" Brandon asked cautiously, trying to break the ice. Joshua glanced at him, seemingly surprised by the attempt at conversation. "They always are." Brandon hesitated before speaking again. "You don't have to pay for everything, you know. I can get a job." Joshua scoffed. "And do what? Serve coffee? Answer phones? You wouldn't make enough to cover even a fraction of what your mother needs." The words stung, but Brandon bit his tongue. Joshua wasn't wrong, but the way he said it was cutting. "I don't want to feel like I'm just taking," Brandon said quietly. Joshua poured himself a drink and leaned against the counter. "You're not. You're fulfilling your end of the deal. That's all that matters." "Is that really all this is to you?" Brandon asked, unable to hide the bitterness in his voice. "A deal?" Joshua's gaze hardened. "Yes, that's exactly what this is. Don't fool yourself into thinking it's anything more." Brandon swallowed the lump in his throat and turned his attention back to the TV. The conversation was over before it even began, and the wall between them felt higher than ever. The next day, Brandon decided to visit his mother at the hospital. It had been weeks since he'd last seen her, and the thought of her alone in that sterile room filled him with guilt. When he arrived, he found her sitting up in bed, her frail body propped against a mountain of pillows. Despite her weakened state, she smiled brightly when she saw him. "Bran," she said, her voice soft but warm, "you look so handsome. Is that a new shirt?" Brandon laughed lightly and sat down beside her. "It's just something I threw on." They talked for a while, mostly about small things, her nurses, the view from her window, a show she'd been watching. Brandon didn't mention the wedding. He couldn't bring himself to tell her about the arrangement he'd made or the man he'd married out of necessity. As they talked, a nurse entered with her medication. Brandon watched as his mother struggled to swallow the pills, her hands trembling slightly. The sight made his chest ache. "How are you feeling?" he asked, once the nurse had left. "Better," she said, though the effort in her voice betrayed her. "The doctors say I'm stable for now." Brandon forced a smile. "That's good, really good." His mother reached out and took his hand, her grip weak but comforting. "You've been working so hard to take care of me, Bran. I don't know what I'd do without you." Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, but he blinked them away. "You don't have to worry about anything, Mom. I've got it all under control." When Brandon returned to the penthouse that evening, he found Joshua in the kitchen making himself a sandwich. It was the first time Brandon had seen him do something so normal. "You're home early," Brandon remarked, setting his bag down. Joshua shrugged. "I had a meeting canceled." Brandon hesitated before speaking. "I went to see my mom today." Joshua nodded but didn't look up. "How is she?" Stable, Brandon replied. For now. The silence that followed was heavy, but Brandon decided to take a risk. You know, I don't think I've ever seen you visit your family. Joshua froze for a moment before continuing to assemble his sandwich. They don't need me to visit. As long as I'm doing my part, they're satisfied. Doing your part, Brandon repeated, frowning. Is that all your family cares about? Joshua looked up then, his eyes sharp. What else would they care about? Love? Sentiment? Those things don't keep the company afloat or protect our reputation. Brandon wanted to argue, but he could see the truth in Joshua's words. It made him sad, though he wasn't sure why. Must be lonely, Brandon said softly. Joshua's expression flickered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with indifference. It is what it is. That night, Brandon lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't stop thinking about Joshua's words or the way his eyes had softened, just for a moment. Despite everything, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Joshua than he let on. Maybe, just maybe, there was a part of him that wanted something more than the cold, detached life he'd built for himself. But for now, Joshua was a puzzle Brandon wasn't sure he could solve, and as much as it hurt, he wasn't sure if he even wanted to try. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Facade. Days turned into weeks, and Brandon slowly began adjusting to his new life in Joshua's penthouse. Though they barely interacted, small routines started to form. Brandon would prepare simple breakfasts for himself, often leaving some for Joshua, though the older man rarely acknowledged it. Joshua, in turn, left Brandon alone, retreating into his work and only emerging for brief cold exchanges. It wasn't much, but it was something. Brandon tried to keep himself busy. He cleaned the already spotless apartment, browsed job listings despite Joshua's earlier dismissal, and occasionally went out to visit his mother. But no matter what he did, the loneliness lingered. One evening, Joshua arrived home earlier than usual. Brandon was on the couch flipping through a book he'd borrowed from the library. Joshua looked tense, his usual composed demeanor replaced with something heavier. Bad day? Brandon asked hesitantly. Joshua sighed, loosening his tie as he poured himself a drink. You could say that. Brandon watched him for a moment before setting his book aside. Do you want to talk about it? Joshua glanced at him, surprised. Why would I? I don't know, Brandon said, shrugging. Sometimes it helps. Joshua let out a humorless laugh. Talking doesn't fix anything. Brandon frowned but didn't push. He wasn't sure why he even cared. Joshua had made it clear that their relationship was purely transactional, yet Brandon couldn't help but feel a flicker of concern whenever he saw the cracks in Joshua's icy exterior. Suit yourself, Brandon muttered, returning to his book. Later that night, as Brandon was tidying up the living room, he found a folder Joshua had left on the coffee table. It was thick with documents, and though Brandon knew it wasn't his place, curiosity got the better of him. He skimmed the pages, his eyes widening as he realized what he was looking at. The documents detailed a hostile takeover of a rival company, with Joshua's name plastered across every page. It was ruthless, calculated, and entirely in line with what little Brandon knew about him. What are you doing? Brandon jumped, nearly dropping the folder as he turned to see Joshua standing in the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. I wasn't... Joshua walked over and snatched the folder from his hands. You shouldn't be touching things that don't concern you. I'm sorry, Brandon said quickly. I didn't mean to pry. Joshua narrowed his eyes but didn't press further. Instead, he turned and walked toward his office, leaving Brandon feeling both guilty and uneasy. The tension between them lingered for days. Joshua became even more withdrawn, while Brandon wrestled with the realization that he knew so little about the man he'd married. One afternoon, Brandon decided to take matters into his own hands. He waited until Joshua was in his office before knocking lightly on the door. What? Came Joshua's curt reply. Brandon opened the door and stepped inside, his heart pounding. We need to talk. Joshua didn't look up from his laptop. I'm busy. This can't wait, Brandon insisted, crossing his arms. Joshua sighed and closed his laptop, finally giving Brandon his full attention. What is it? Brandon hesitated, his courage wavering under Joshua's sharp gaze. I don't know anything about you. We're married, and I feel like I'm living with a stranger. Joshua raised an eyebrow. Isn't that what you wanted? To keep this arrangement impersonal? I never said that, Brandon countered. You're the one who's made it clear that this marriage is just a deal. But we're stuck with each other, so the least we can do is try to understand each other. Joshua leaned back in his chair, studying Brandon with an expression that was equal parts amused and annoyed. And what exactly do you want to know? Anything, Brandon said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Why are you like this? Why do you act like you don't care about anything or anyone? For a moment, Joshua said nothing. Then he stood, walking over to the window and staring out at the city lights. Because caring makes you weak, he said finally, his voice low. It gives people power over you, and I learned a long time ago that power is the only thing that matters. Brandon frowned. That's a sad way to live. Joshua turned to him, his eyes cold. Maybe, but it's the only way to survive. Brandon wanted to argue, to tell Joshua that he was wrong, but he could see the pain buried beneath his stoic facade. Whatever had made Joshua this way, it wasn't something Brandon could fix. Fine, Brandon said softly, but you're not alone anymore, whether you like it or not. And maybe it wouldn't kill you to let someone in once in a while. Oh, Joshua didn't respond, and Brandon took that as his cue to leave. That night, as Brandon lay on the couch, he couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. For the first time, he felt like he'd caught a glimpse of the real Joshua, the man behind the mask. He didn't know what to do with that glimpse, but one thing was clear. Joshua was more than just the cold, calculating businessman he pretended to be. And whether Brandon wanted to or not, he was starting to care. Chapter 5. Beneath the Ice. The days after their conversation passed in a strange silence. Joshua didn't retreat further into his usual aloofness, but he didn't open up either. It was as if the tension between them had shifted into something unspoken, a thread connecting them that neither was willing to address. Brandon, however, found himself increasingly curious about the man he'd married. Joshua's words, about caring making you weak, lingered in his mind, stirring questions he didn't know how to ask. One evening, Brandon was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Cooking was one of the few things that made him feel normal in the sprawling, sterile penthouse. As he chopped vegetables, he heard the sound of the front door opening. Joshua walked in, his jacket draped over his arm and his tie already loosened. He paused in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Brandon with an unreadable expression. "You're cooking?" Joshua asked, his tone more curious than judgmental. Brandon nodded, not looking up. "I figured it's better than ordering takeout every night." Joshua leaned against the counter, his gaze steady. "I didn't think you knew how to cook." Brandon smirked, glancing at him. "There's a lot you don't know about me." The corner of Joshua's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile, but he quickly masked it. "Fair enough." For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence was oddly comfortable, a stark contrast to their usual tension. "Do you want to help?" Brandon asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Joshua blinked. "Help?" "Yeah," Brandon said, holding up a knife. "You can chop these onions while I finish the sauce." Joshua hesitated, but after a moment, he rolled up his sleeves and stepped closer. He took the knife, his movements stiff and unsure. "You've never done this before, have you?" Brandon asked, laughing softly. Joshua glared at him, though there was no real malice in his eyes. "I don't exactly have time for domestic hobbies." Well, consider this a crash course," Brandon said, guiding Joshua's hands as he demonstrated how to chop the onion. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Brandon felt a jolt of something he couldn't quite name. Joshua seemed unaffected, though his jaw tightened slightly. By the time they finished cooking, the kitchen was a mess, but the air between them felt lighter. They sat at the dining table, eating in a companionable silence, that was broken only by the occasional comment about the food. "This is surprisingly good," Joshua admitted after a few bites. "Surprisingly?" Brandon teased, raising an eyebrow. Joshua smirked. "Don't get cocky." Brandon rolled his eyes but couldn't hide his smile. For the first time, he felt like they were two normal people sharing a meal, rather than two strangers trapped in a transactional marriage. Later that night, Brandon found himself lying awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling as his thoughts raced. He thought about the way Joshua had seemed almost human during dinner, the faint smirk, the brief glimmer of something softer in his eyes. It was a side of him Brandon hadn't seen before, and it made him wonder if there was more beneath the icy exterior. But even as he entertained the thought, he reminded himself of the reality of their situation. Joshua had made it clear that he didn't want anything real between them, and Brandon couldn't afford to let himself hope for something that didn't exist. The next morning, Brandon woke to the sound of clinking dishes. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and was surprised to find Joshua in the kitchen, making coffee. "You're up early," Brandon said, stretching as he walked over. Joshua glanced at him, his expression neutral. "I have a meeting in an hour." Brandon poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning against the counter. "You didn't have to clean up last night, you know. I would have done it." "It's fine," Joshua said, taking a sip of his coffee. "I don't like leaving things unfinished." Brandon smiled faintly. "Thanks." Joshua didn't reply, but there was a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. As the days passed, their interactions became less stilted. Joshua still kept his distance, but he no longer dismissed Brandon's attempts to engage with him. They began sharing meals more often, talking about small things, work, the city, their favorite foods. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Brandon found himself glancing at Joshua out of the corner of his eye. "What?" Joshua asked without looking away from the screen. "Nothing," Brandon said quickly, though his cheeks flushed. Joshua smirked faintly. "You're a terrible liar." Brandon hesitated, then blurted out, "Do you ever regret this? The marriage, I mean." Joshua's expression turned serious. He didn't answer right away, and for a moment Brandon thought he wouldn't. Finally, Joshua spoke, his voice low. "I don't know. Do you?" Brandon swallowed hard, caught off guard by the question. "I don't know either." They sat in silence after that, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. That night, as Brandon lay on the couch, he couldn't stop thinking about Joshua's answer, or the fact that, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he regretted it either. Chapter 6. Signs of Change. The growing sense of familiarity between Joshua and Brandon was subtle, but it was there. The cold silence that used to dominate their home had given way to small moments of shared comfort, like watching TV together, sharing quiet meals, or even exchanging sarcastic remarks. Brandon found himself waiting for these moments, no matter how fleeting they were. It was a dangerous game, letting himself hope for more, but he couldn't help it. Joshua was an enigma, and the small glimpses of vulnerability Brandon had seen only deepened his curiosity. One evening, Brandon was sitting on the couch sketching. It was a hobby he'd picked up years ago, and though he wasn't particularly skilled, it helped him relax. Joshua walked in, his tie undone, and his hair slightly disheveled. He stopped when he noticed Brandon, his gaze drifting to the sketchpad. "What are you doing?" Joshua asked, his voice softer than usual. "Just sketching," Brandon replied, without looking up. Joshua moved closer, peering over Brandon's shoulder. "That's not bad," Brandon snorted. "High praise coming from you." Joshua smirked faintly, but there was genuine interest in his expression. "Did you study art?" "No," Brandon said, setting the pencil down. "It's just a hobby, something to pass the time." Joshua was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "You're good at it. You should do it more often." Brandon blinked, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks." Joshua nodded, then turned and headed to his office, leaving Brandon alone with a strange warmth in his chest. The next morning, Brandon woke up to find a small gift box on the kitchen counter. Confused, he opened it to reveal a set of high-quality sketching pencils and a leather-bound sketchbook. He stared at the items in disbelief, his heart pounding. There was no note, but he didn't need one to know who it was from. When Joshua walked into the kitchen a few minutes later, Brandon couldn't stop himself from smiling. "Is this from you?" Brandon asked, holding up the sketchbook. Joshua shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "I figured you could use something better than whatever you were using before." Brandon bit his lip to keep from grinning. "Thank you." Joshua nodded, avoiding Brandon's gaze. "It's nothing." But to Brandon, it wasn't nothing. It was the first time Joshua had done something thoughtful without being prompted, and it made Brandon wonder if there was more to him than he let on. That evening, Brandon decided to push his luck. After dinner, he brought out the new sketchbook and pencils and sat on the couch, sketching while Joshua worked on his laptop. "What are you drawing?" Joshua asked after a while, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Nothing specific," Brandon replied, his pencil moving across the page. "Just whatever comes to mind." Joshua set his laptop aside and leaned closer to watch. Brandon's hand faltered slightly under the weight of Joshua's gaze, but he kept going. "You're really talented," Joshua said after a moment, his voice unusually soft. Brandon glanced at him, his cheeks flushing. "Thanks. It's just a hobby, though." "Maybe it shouldn't be," Joshua said, meeting Brandon's eyes. Brandon's breath caught. There was something in Joshua's expression, something unguarded and sincere, that made his heart ache. "I'll think about it," Brandon said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. As the days passed, Joshua's small acts of kindness became more frequent. He started leaving notes for Brandon when he had to leave early, reminding him to eat or suggesting places to visit in the city. He even surprised Brandon with tickets to an art exhibit, though he claimed it was just something to do. Brandon couldn't help but feel like things were changing between them. Joshua was still guarded, but the walls he'd built around himself seemed to be cracking, bit by bit. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Brandon decided to take another leap. "Why did you marry me?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Joshua tensed, his expression hardening. "We've been over this. It was a deal." "I know," Brandon said quickly. "But why me? You could have found someone else, someone more convenient." Joshua was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the coffee table. Finally, he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "At the time, it just seemed like the easiest solution." Brandon's heart sank at the bluntness of Joshua's words, but he pressed on. "And now?" Joshua looked at him then, his eyes conflicted. "Now, I don't know." Brandon nodded, though his chest felt tight. It wasn't the answer he'd wanted, but it was honest. That night, as Brandon lay awake, he thought about Joshua's words. He didn't know what the future held for them, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. Because even though Joshua didn't have all the answers, it was clear that something between them was beginning to change. And maybe, just maybe, it was a change worth fighting for. Chapter 7. Unveiling the Past. The weeks rolled on, and the tentative truce between Joshua and Brandon grew into something neither of them could name. The icy walls Joshua had built around himself seemed to thaw a little each day, and Brandon found himself treasuring the rare moments of warmth that slipped through. But for every step forward, there were moments of doubt, reminders that their relationship was still built on shaky foundations. One evening, Joshua returned home late. Brandon was in the living room sketching, his usual way of winding down. When Joshua walked in, Brandon noticed the exhaustion etched across his face. "You okay?" Brandon asked, setting his sketchbook aside. Joshua nodded, though his shoulders sagged. "Just a long day." "Do you want to talk about it?" Brandon offered, as he always did. To his surprise, Joshua hesitated. Usually, he brushed off the question, but tonight, something in his eyes seemed different, heavier. "It's nothing," Joshua said eventually, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Brandon frowned. You always say that, but it's obviously not nothing. Why can't you just let someone in for once? Joshua's jaw tightened, and for a moment Brandon thought he'd shut down entirely. But then, Joshua sat down on the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You really want to know? Joshua asked, his voice low. Yes, Brandon said softly. Joshua stared at the floor as he began to speak. I didn't grow up like you. My family wasn't kind. My father was a businessman, ruthless and cold. He expected perfection from everyone, especially me. When I didn't meet his standards, he made sure I regretted it. Brandon's heart ached at the bitterness in Joshua's voice. He wanted to reach out to comfort him, but he stayed quiet, letting Joshua continue. My mother tried to protect me, but she wasn't strong enough to stand up to him. She left when I was 10. After that, it was just me and my father. Joshua's hands clenched into fists. I learned early on that caring about anyone made you vulnerable, so I stopped. Brandon felt a lump in his throat. He'd always known there was more to Joshua than the cold facade he presented, but hearing it confirmed was still heartbreaking. You don't have to be like him, Brandon said gently. You're not your father. Joshua laughed bitterly. Aren't I? I've spent my whole life chasing success, just like he did. And look at me now, married to someone I barely know, treating it like a business deal. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Brandon shook his head. You're not him, Joshua. You care more than you let on. I see it, even if you don't. Joshua looked at him then, his eyes filled with something Brandon couldn't quite name. Vulnerability? Regret? You don't know me, Joshua said, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Then let me, Brandon replied, his voice soft but firm. The conversation marked a turning point. Joshua didn't open up completely, but he became less guarded, more willing to let Brandon see glimpses of the man beneath the mask. They started spending more time together, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Joshua even took Brandon to visit his mother in the ICU, a gesture that meant more to Brandon than words could express. One day, as they sat in the hospital waiting room, Brandon turned to Joshua. Thank you, he said softly. For what? Joshua asked, his brow furrowed. For coming here with me. For trying. Joshua looked away, his expression unreadable. You don't have to thank me for that. I do, Brandon insisted. It means a lot to me. Joshua didn't respond, but his hand brushed against Brandon's, lingering for just a moment before pulling away. That night, back at the penthouse, Brandon found himself thinking about Joshua's past. It explained so much, the walls he'd built, the way he kept people at arm's length. But it also made Brandon more determined to break through those walls, no matter how long it took. Because beneath the cold, calculated exterior, Joshua was just a man who'd been hurt too many times. And Brandon couldn't ignore the growing feeling that he wanted to be the one to help him heal. As he drifted off to sleep on the couch, Brandon wondered if Joshua felt the same. Chapter 8. Fractures in the Facade. The fragile peace between Joshua and Brandon was tested when an unexpected visitor appeared. Brandon had been cleaning the living room when the sound of the doorbell interrupted his thoughts. I'll get it, he called out, wiping his hands as he walked to the door. Standing on the other side was a woman, tall, elegant, and confident. She exuded an air of familiarity that Brandon couldn't place, but the sharp look in her eyes told him she wasn't here for pleasantries. Is Joshua home? She asked, her tone cool. Who's asking? Brandon replied cautiously. Clara. I work with him, she said, pushing past him before he could respond. Joshua appeared moments later, his expression darkening the instant he saw her. Clara, he said curtly. What are you doing here? We need to talk, Clara said, glancing briefly at Brandon. Alone. Joshua hesitated, his eyes flicking between her and Brandon before nodding. Fine, let's go to my office. Brandon watched them disappear down the hall, unease settling in his chest. The tension in Joshua's voice was unmistakable, and though he had no reason to feel threatened, the situation left him unsettled. In the office, Clara didn't waste time. "You're losing focus, Joshua," she said, crossing her arms. "I've been covering for you at work, but people are starting to notice. What's going on?" "Nothing that concerns you," Joshua replied, his tone sharp. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Does it have something to do with him?" Joshua's jaw tightened. "Leave Brandon out of this." "I see," Clara said, smirking. "So he's more than just a convenient arrangement now. Interesting." Joshua didn't respond, but the flicker of guilt in his eyes didn't go unnoticed. When Clara left, Joshua found Brandon in the kitchen, preparing tea. "Who was she?" Brandon asked, trying to sound casual. "A colleague," Joshua replied, his voice flat. "It's nothing to worry about." But Brandon wasn't convinced. He didn't press the issue, though. He knew better than to push Joshua when he was like this. Instead, he focused on the tea, hoping the silence between them wouldn't stretch into something deeper. Chapter 9. A Crack in the Armor. Days later, Joshua surprised Brandon with an invitation to dinner. It wasn't one of their typical transactional meals. It felt more personal, more deliberate. "I thought it would be nice to get out for a change," Joshua said as they sat in a quiet, upscale restaurant. Brandon smiled. "I'm not complaining." They talked about small things, work, art, the city, but the atmosphere was lighter than usual. For once, it felt like they were just two people enjoying each other's company. But as the evening wore on, Brandon couldn't shake the feeling that something was bothering Joshua. "Are you okay?" Brandon asked, leaning forward. Joshua hesitated, then nodded. "I'm fine." "You don't seem fine," Brandon said gently. "You can talk to me, you know." Joshua sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's nothing. Work has been complicated." Brandon wanted to press further, but the vulnerability in Joshua's eyes stopped him. Instead, he reached across the table, placing his hand over Joshua's. "I'm here if you need me," Brandon said softly. Joshua looked at him, his expression unreadable, but he didn't pull away. That night back at the penthouse, Joshua lingered in the living room while Brandon sketched. "Why do you stay?" Joshua asked suddenly. Brandon looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "You could have walked away after the wedding," Joshua said, his voice quiet. "But you didn't." "Why?" Brandon set his sketchbook aside, meeting Joshua's gaze. "Because I believe there's more to you than what you let people see. And because I care about you, even if you don't think you deserve it." Joshua's eyes softened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he nodded slightly before retreating to his room, leaving Brandon alone with his thoughts. Chapter 10. The Unseen Storm. The fragile connection they'd built was tested again when Brandon received unexpected news. He'd been feeling off for weeks, tired, nauseous, and emotional. At first, he dismissed it as stress, but a trip to the doctor confirmed his suspicions. He was pregnant. Brandon stared at the positive test in his hands, his heart racing. He hadn't even considered the possibility, especially not in their situation. But now, faced with the reality of it, he didn't know what to do. Would Joshua want the baby? Would he even care? That evening, Brandon decided to tell Joshua. He found him in his office, working late as usual. "Joshua, can we talk?" Brandon asked, his voice trembling. Joshua looked up, frowning at the nervousness in Brandon's tone. "What is it?" Brandon hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." Joshua froze, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock. "You're what?" Joshua said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant," Brandon repeated, his hands shaking. Joshua stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This wasn't supposed to happen. You—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "Are you sure?" Brandon nodded, his chest tightening. "Yes." Joshua didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold. "I need time to think." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Brandon alone with his fears. That night, Brandon lay awake, wondering if he'd made a mistake. But as he placed a hand over his stomach, He resolved to protect the life growing inside him, no matter what Joshua decided. Because for the first time, he had someone else to fight for, and he wasn't going to let them down. Chapter 11. The silence between them. The days following Brandon's revelation were suffocating. Joshua avoided him, burying himself in work and spending long hours at the office. When he was home, he barely acknowledged Brandon, and the distance between them felt like a chasm. Brandon tried to stay strong, but the silence weighed on him. He spent most of his time in his room, sketching or reading, to distract himself from the growing ache in his chest. One night, Joshua came home late. Brandon was sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV, but his mind was elsewhere. Joshua paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Why are you still up?" Brandon shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." Joshua hesitated before sitting down in the armchair across from him. They sat in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. "I'm sorry," Joshua said suddenly, his voice low. Brandon looked at him, startled. "For what?" "For shutting you out," Joshua admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. I didn't know how to handle it." Brandon's heart softened, but he still felt a pang of frustration. "You could have talked to me. I didn't expect you to have all the answers, but I needed you to at least try." Joshua nodded, his shoulders sagging. "I know. And I will. I just need time to figure things out." Brandon sighed but didn't push further. It wasn't the resolution he'd hoped for, but it was a start. Chapter 12. Small Steps. Joshua made an effort to be more present after their conversation. He started coming home earlier, checking in on Brandon, and even accompanying him to a doctor's appointment. It wasn't easy. Joshua still struggled to open up, and Brandon often felt like he was walking on eggshells around him. But the small gestures of effort gave Brandon hope that they could navigate this new chapter together. At the doctor's office, Joshua sat beside Brandon, his expression tense but attentive. "The baby's healthy," the doctor said, smiling at them. "You're doing great so far, Brandon." Joshua's eyes flicked to the ultrasound screen, where a tiny shape was visible. For the first time, he seemed genuinely affected, his usual mask slipping. "That's our baby," Joshua murmured, his voice tinged with awe. Brandon smiled, his own eyes misting. "Yeah, that's our baby." For a moment, it felt like they were on the same page, like they could face this together. Chapter 13. A Glimpse of Hope. As Brandon's pregnancy progressed, their relationship continued to evolve. Joshua still had moments of hesitation, but he was more involved now, helping Brandon with small tasks, asking about the baby, and even taking an interest in his sketches. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Joshua surprised Brandon by asking about baby names. "Have you thought of any?" Joshua asked, his tone casual. Brandon blinked, caught off guard. "Not really. I didn't think you'd want to discuss it yet." Joshua looked slightly embarrassed but pressed on. "Well, we should start thinking about it, right? It's important." Brandon smiled. "Okay, any ideas?" Joshua hesitated before suggesting a name. "What about Emma? If it's a girl, I mean." Brandon's heart warmed at the thought. "Emma's lovely. And if it's a boy?" Joshua thought for a moment. "Ethan, maybe?" Brandon nodded. "I like it. Ethan or Emma. They're perfect." For the first time, it felt like they were planning for the future together. Chapter 14. Cracks in the Armor. Despite their progress, Joshua's past continued to haunt him. One night, after an intense day at work, he came home visibly agitated. Brandon tried to comfort him, but Joshua lashed out, his frustration spilling over. "I didn't ask for this," Joshua snapped, his voice sharp. "Any of it. The marriage, the baby. None of it was part of the plan." Brandon froze, his chest tightening. "Do you regret it?" Joshua's expression softened, guilt flashing in his eyes. "I don't know," he admitted. "I'm just overwhelmed." Brandon bit his lip, fighting back tears. "I didn't ask for this either, Joshua, but I'm trying. For the baby, for us. Can't you at least try to? Joshua sighed, running a hand through his hair. I am trying, Brandon. I just don't know if it'll ever be enough. Brandon didn't respond, his heart heavy with uncertainty. Chapter 15. A Turning Point. The tension between them reached a breaking point one rainy evening. Brandon had spent the day preparing a small dinner, hoping to lighten the mood, but Joshua came home late and distracted. As they sat at the table, the silence was deafening. Joshua, Brandon said quietly, we can't keep doing this. Joshua looked up, frowning. Doing what? This halfway thing, Brandon said, gesturing between them. You're here, but you're not here, and it's killing me. Joshua sighed, leaning back in his chair. What do you want me to say, Brandon? That I have everything figured out? Because I don't. I don't need you to have all the answers, Brandon said, his voice trembling. I just need you to let me in, to let me help you. Joshua was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he spoke. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Brandon's eyes widened. Of what? Of losing everything, Joshua said. Of failing. Of getting attached and then having it all fall apart. Brandon reached across the table, taking Joshua's hand in his. You won't lose me, Joshua, or the baby. But you have to let yourself believe that. Joshua looked at him, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. I don't know if I can. You can, Brandon said firmly, and I'll be here every step of the way. For the first time, Joshua's walls seemed to crumble completely. He squeezed Brandon's hand, his grip firm but trembling. Thank you, he said softly. In that moment, Brandon knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time it felt like they were truly in it together. Chapter 16. A New Beginnings. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions, uncertainty, and small victories. Joshua and Brandon slowly began to rebuild their connection. There were moments of tension, of course, times when the past resurfaced, threatening to tear them apart. But there were also moments of growth, where they showed each other tenderness and vulnerability. One evening, as Brandon stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner, Joshua entered the room. He watched him quietly for a moment before speaking. I've been thinking about what you said, Joshua began, his voice low, about not letting you in. Brandon glanced over at him, surprised. And? I was wrong, Joshua admitted, his tone sincere. I've been holding back, pushing you away, but I don't want to anymore. Brandon smiled softly, his heart swelling with relief. You don't have to be perfect, Joshua. You just have to be here. Joshua walked over, stopping just behind him. He rested a hand on Brandon's shoulder, a simple yet meaningful gesture. I'll try for both of us, for the baby. The warmth between them was palpable, a promise of what was to come. Chapter 17. The Unexpected Test. As Brandon's pregnancy entered its final trimester, things seemed to be going smoothly, at least on the surface. However, an unexpected complication arose during one of Brandon's routine doctor visits. You've been feeling any unusual pain or discomfort? The doctor asked, his expression serious. Brandon shook his head. No, just the usual pregnancy stuff. The doctor examined him further, his brow furrowing. There's some swelling, and your blood pressure is a little higher than it should be. We'll need to keep a close eye on it. Brandon's heart raced as the doctor continued explaining potential risks and what they needed to monitor. It was one of those moments that felt like a gut punch. Everything could be fine, but there was always a chance things could go wrong. He didn't want to tell Joshua just yet. He didn't want to worry him, but he couldn't shake the fear building in his chest. Later that evening, Joshua returned home, his usual calm demeanor still intact, but Brandon noticed the tiredness in his eyes. It was more than just a long day at work. I have something to tell you, Brandon said quietly as they sat down together. Joshua looked up, his face softening. What's wrong? Brandon hesitated before speaking. The doctor said there's a chance my blood pressure could cause complications with the pregnancy. We have to keep an eye on it. Joshua's face went pale, the concern evident in his eyes. What does that mean? Is everything going to be okay? I don't know, Brandon admitted. I'm going to take it easy, but it's not something I can control. Joshua reached for Brandon's hand, squeezing it gently. We'll get through this, okay? I'll be here with you. Brandon nodded, grateful for the reassurance, even if he couldn't shake the fear of the unknown. Chapter 18. The Calm Before the Storm. The next few weeks were filled with doctor's visits, constant monitoring, and moments of anxiety. Joshua was by Brandon's side through it all, his presence a comforting anchor. The tension from before seemed to ease as they both focused on the one thing that mattered most, their growing family. Despite the stress, there were moments of joy. One afternoon, as Brandon sat on the couch, his hands resting on his belly, Joshua came in with a small box. What's this? Brandon asked, raising an eyebrow. Joshua smiled softly. A little something for the baby. Brandon opened the box to find a tiny pair of baby shoes, soft and delicate. His eyes welled up with emotion. They're perfect, Brandon whispered, holding them close to his chest. Thank you. Joshua's hand rested lightly on Brandon's shoulder, and for a moment, they just sat there, feeling the quiet bond between them grow stronger. Chapter 19. The Storm Breaks. The storm finally hit on a rainy afternoon. Brandon's blood pressure spiked dangerously, and he started experiencing severe pain. Joshua rushed him to the hospital, panic rising in his chest as he held Brandon's hand through the ordeal. When they arrived, doctors quickly took over, rushing Brandon into a room for immediate monitoring. Joshua paced the waiting room, his nerves frayed as he waited for news. Hours passed, and still no word. His mind raced with worst-case scenarios, wondering if he'd lose Brandon and the baby before they even had a chance to build the life they'd started to imagine. Finally, the doctor came out, her face serious but not grave. Brandon's blood pressure is stabilizing, but we're going to keep him overnight for observation. He's not out of the woods yet, but we're hopeful. Joshua let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, relief flooding him. He walked into Brandon's room, his heart heavy with emotion. Brandon lay in bed, looking pale but awake. You're okay, Joshua whispered, sitting down beside him. Brandon gave him a weak smile. I'm okay, he said softly, just a little scared. Joshua's hand rested gently on Brandon's. I'm scared too, but we'll get through this. Brandon nodded, and for the first time in weeks he felt Joshua truly present, truly there, no longer just a distant observer in their shared life, but a partner in every sense of the word. Chapter 20. The Birth of New Beginnings. After several days of rest and careful monitoring, Brandon was discharged from the hospital, his condition stable for now. Joshua never left his side, and for the first time, it felt like they were in this together. As Brandon neared the end of his pregnancy, they both grew more excited, though there was still a lingering anxiety about the complications. But with each passing day, they learned to focus less on the fears and more on the joy of what was to come. Finally, the day arrived. Brandon's water broke late one night, and Joshua rushed him to the hospital, his heart pounding in his chest. The hours that followed were filled with pain, sweat, and fear, but also with a determination that both of them had never known before. By the early morning hours, their baby was born, healthy, crying, and beautiful. Joshua held the tiny baby in his arms, his eyes wide with wonder. He looked at Brandon, a silent promise passing between them. We did it, Joshua whispered. Brandon smiled through his tears. We did. And in that moment, surrounded by the love they had fought so hard to build, they knew this was just the beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next, no matter what.